Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we looked at the Vienna, where white throws the f-pawn forward and tries to make life miserable for black as early as move 3. Today we are doing something very similar, except now we are doing it with the black pieces and against one of the most popular openings in all of chess, the Italian game. And the move we are looking at is this slightly unhinged, very aggressive, very eyebrow-raising move: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, f5. At first glance, this move looks insane. It walks a pawn onto a defended square, it weakens the light squares around black's king, and white has literally just developed a bishop c4, which is staring straight through those light squares like a laser beam. So if you have never seen this before, your first reaction is probably something like, "What on earth is black doing?" But that is exactly why this gambit is so interesting. Because although it looks risky, and yes, objectively it is a bit risky, it is not nearly as reckless as it seems. White does not have some immediate refutation. In fact, white very often has no clear idea what to do at all, and that is where the Rousseau Gambit starts paying rent. And that is really the whole selling point of this opening. Would I recommend it as your one and only weapon against the Italian, something you play 100% of the time? Probably not. If you want a fully stable, sober, accountant-approved life against e4, this is not that. But if you like active play, if you like open lines, if you like the idea of white thinking they are punishing you and then somehow ending up on the defensive by move 7, then yes, I absolutely think this gambit is worth having in your repertoire. So let us start with the most common move, because naturally people see a pawn on f5 and they just take it. Takes f5. This is very similar to what happens in the Vienna. People grab the pawn first and ask questions later. But here, in some ways, it is even worse for white than it is in the Vienna, because now black gets the move that really defines the whole opening, d5. This move is the cornerstone of the Rousseau Gambit. You hit the bishop c4 with tempo, you strike in the center, and suddenly white's bishop placement, which looked so nice one move ago, becomes something you can exploit. That bishop c4 is not just a pretty piece, it can actually become a tactical target. Before continuing with the main line, I do want to say that white has other tries on move 4, and some of them are more sensible than just grabbing the pawn. One of the more sensible ones is d3. This is actually a good move. White strengthens the center, does not commit too much, and says, "All right, if you want chaos, I am not giving it to you for free." Then black continues knight f6, and here one move a lot of white players seem to love is knight g5, going after the f7 square, as if this is some kind of two knights defense fork party. But honestly, this is often exactly what black wants. Active play, imbalance, and white drifting into some half-tactical, half-dubious mess. Of course we need to defend against the fork with d5, all standard stuff. White usually takes on d5, and here there is actually a very fancy move b5, which is pretty attractive. The point is that if white takes on b5, then black gets to take on d5 with the queen rather than the knight, which is much more elegant and much more centralized. If white retreats the bishop instead, then knight d4 ideas start to loom. And taking on c6 is also not so attractive because white gives up that very important light square bishop. So yes, b5 is a real move, but the position gets complicated very quickly, and I suspect that if some of you try that line without enough practice, there is a decent chance the whole thing goes off the rails. So the simpler move I would recommend is knight a5. We hit the bishop, we aim for the bishop pair, we want bishop d6, we want to castle, and white's knight g5, which came in with dreams of forking on f7, suddenly looks much less heroic and much more awkward. White's best reply here is bishop b5 check, very similar to known themes from the two knights defense, and if you know, you know. Black continues c6, takes c6, takes c6, bishop a4, bishop d6, and after that black just finishes development and starts asking serious questions about the misplaced knight g5. White is not winning here. White is the one who has to justify their play. The best way to proceed for white on move 5 is actually just to castle. White should not be afraid of black grabbing the e4 pawn right away, because black is simply too undeveloped for that to be wise. So instead, black should focus on proper development with bishop c5, and now the plans for black are very clear. You often want d6, and then depending on circumstances, you might even think about f4, completely closing the center and making it much harder for white to challenge your kingside ambitions. Once that happens, white cannot easily take on f5 and then break with d4, and black can start dreaming of all the nice things that proud Rousseau players dream of: kingside pressure, an open or semi-open f-file, maybe g5 and g4, maybe queen e7 and bishop e6, maybe knight f5 to challenge that bishop c4 again. In other words, if black gets the setup they want, the opening becomes much more about practical attack than some neat little engine plus sign. Now, after the best move knight c3, you could actually try playing f4 instead of the more conventional d6. Because if white does not know the immediate counter with d4, black can very easily get a dream position with d6, bishop g4, maybe g5, and queen maneuvers like queen e7 and queen g7, with everything aimed at white's king. That really is the kind of position you sign up for when you play the Rousseau. But if we stick to d6, then after bishop g5, yes, the pin is a bit annoying. That would have been one advantage of closing the center earlier with f4. Still, black has the very thematic move knight a5, going straight after white's light-squared bishop. And now we get one of those engine sequences that is both impressive and deeply annoying. After bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, b4, white somehow manages to keep some pull. And yes, that is engine stuff. Barely anybody is ever going to play this over the board in blitz, and certainly not with confidence. Black continues, knight takes c4, takes c5, knight a5, and yes, positionally, white may claim a little something, but let us not exaggerate. Black is not getting blown off the board. Black castles next. Black can consider taking on e4 with ideas like bishop g4, or black can go for a more closed setup with f4 and then potentially g5 and g4. If white jumps in with knight d5, black can calmly play queen d8, guard c7, and keep playing. The game continues. This is not some forced refutation where you are dead by move 10. It is just one of those lines where the engine says white is a bit more comfortable, but a human still has to actually prove that. Another move people often play after d3 and knight f6 is knight c3, which on Lichess seems to be one of the most popular continuations. A lot of white players here are worried about the pawn on e4, as if it absolutely must be defended, even though that is not really the point of the position, and that lets black play very comfortably with bishop b4. Black pins the knight, develops with tempo, and now has a very clear strategic recipe. Maybe take on c3, maybe take on e4 at the right moment, and then continue to neutralize white's light-squared bishop with moves like d6, knight f5, or queen e7, followed by bishop e6. White also should not think they are scaring black too much with ideas like knight g5, because after queen e7, there is no fork on f7 anymore. And ideas like bishop f7 check often just cost white way too much time. And honestly, at the start of a blitz game, having a clear plan is half the battle already. Now let us jump back for a second, because white can also choose not to take on f5 and instead play knight c3 immediately. This is the fourth most common move in blitz, and on lower ratings it sometimes even jumps up to third. And the fact that this move pretty much loses on the spot tells you a lot about how effective this gambit can be in practice. Black just goes takes e4, knight takes e4, d5, and suddenly white realizes that the bishop c4 is hanging, the knight e4 is under pressure, and the whole position is falling apart. It is kind of amazing how many games just end right there, because white tried to develop naturally against an opening where natural moves are not enough. There is also the little sideline bishop takes g8, where white suddenly realizes they are about to get forked and decide to drift away. But this is too late. After rook takes g8 or even takes f3, black gets a fantastic game. For example, after takes f3, bishop d5 takes g2, bishop takes g2, queen h4, black is a pawn up, dominates the dark squares, develops very quickly with bishop c5 and castling, and white's pieces are all over the place. So even these clever tries often just drift into a very comfortable version of chaos for black. Objectively, the best move for white on move 4 is not takes f5, not d3, not knight c3, but d4. And this is exactly what you would expect if you have watched the Vienna video, because whenever one side pushes the f-pawn early, a central strike with d4 or d5 is often the most principled reaction. What I found interesting is that white players seem less inclined to play d4 here than they are to play d5 against the Vienna. Even on higher levels, people often drift toward calmer moves like d3 or the outright bad takes f5. I think part of the reason is psychological. In the Vienna, the structure is more familiar. You see f4, you think strike in the center. Here, because white already has the bishop c4, the bishop placement changes the visual impression of the position, and maybe that is enough to lead people astray. Whatever the reason, the trend is clear. After d4, black should take with takes e4, knight takes e5, and then immediately strike back with d5. Again, this move is the cornerstone of the gambit. You hit the bishop, you take central space, and you remind white that they are not the only one allowed to play actively. White can retreat with bishop b5, and then things get interesting. One very tempting move for white here is queen h5 check. On beginner level especially, this move looks terrifying. You bring the queen out, you check the king, you IF7 and h7, and it all feels very close to checkmate. But it actually loses. Black calmly plays g6, which of course is forced, and then white's usual trick is knight takes g6. That is the idea. Exploit the pin on the h-pawn and try to rip open the king side. There is also the alternative knight takes c6, g takes h5, knight takes d8, d takes c4, bishop g5, bishop e7, bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, and the knight on d8 is trapped, so that line also goes nowhere good for white. But after knight takes g6, we can simply just play knight f6, the queen has to go, then we take on g6 and on c4, and even though we lose the rook on h8, two pieces are obviously better than the rook. Now back to the more sound move bishop b5. Black has the cold-blooded move queen d6 if we follow your move order through the main idea, and after bishop f4, white may look like they are suddenly getting discovered attacks on the queen, but not really. In fact, almost wherever that knight e5 goes, the bishop f4 hangs, so white's attack is much less real than it looks. Then black continues a 6, kicking the bishop, and after bishop takes c6, b takes c6, castling. White has more or less admitted that there was no immediate kill here. White also tries queen h5 check surprisingly often, but after g6, the queen simply has to go home. So that whole huge attack often turns out to be a bit of theater. But anyway, back to castling. I would recommend knight f6. And this is where the Rousseau Gambit starts becoming genuinely hilarious, because black is willing to go for a queen sacrifice for two pieces. After knight g6, which almost everyone seems unable to resist because the discovered attack looks so tempting and white dreams of winning the rook as well, black simply plays h takes g6. And that is the point. Black was never planning to save the queen. Black takes the knight, opens the h-file, and suddenly all the previously sleepy pieces wake up. The bishop will come bishop d6. The rook on h8 now has a job. The bishop c8 comes to life. The knight joins. Even the g-pawn may join the fun. And perhaps most importantly, black has managed to get rid of white's most annoying active pieces. So yes, black is very happy to say, please take my queen. I have other plans. After bishop takes d6, h2 is hanging, and white already has difficult choices. If white pushes h3, that gives black a hook for the g-pawn. If white pushes g3, that weakens the light squares terribly and gives black ideas like bishop g4 or knight g4. The point is not so much that you need to memorize every move, but that you understand the spirit of the position. Black's compensation is real, black's attack is dangerous, and this queen sacrifice is not some drunken pub trick. It is fully sound in practical terms. One very natural continuation is h3, g5. Of course, black wants g4, and white is already feeling rather uncomfortable. Many players then go f3, trying to keep the king side shut for at least one move. But then black throws in bishop takes h3, so now we have sacrificed the queen, and a bishop is being thrown into the fire as well. Very civilized opening, this. If white declines and plays something like knight c3, black can simply retreat the bishop and keep attacking along the h-file and dark squares. But if white accepts with g takes h3, then after rook takes h3, suddenly everything is pointing at the king. White often tries f takes e4, hoping to do something in the center before the avalanche lands, but after rook g3, king f2, knight takes e4, king e2, long castle, black has completed development in the most Rousseau Gambit way imaginable. The long castle brings in the final rook, and then after queen e1, rook h8, king d1, rook g2, black is just swarming. Another rook is ready to come in on the second rank. Bishop g3 is a real idea. White is almost paralyzed. And that extra queen really does not feel like much of an asset when all your pieces are tripping over each other and your king is one bad move away from being hunted down. The engine may still claim that white can hold somehow. Engines are very calm people. But practically speaking, I would be very surprised if many humans survive that without collapsing soon after. There is another move white sometimes tries on move 4, bishop takes g8. At first glance, this looks clever. White says, fine, you want to play a weird gambit? I will just take your knight, ruin your castling rights, and ask you to prove compensation. But in reality, white often helps black by giving up that very important light-squared bishop. After rook takes g8, takes f5, black is still doing extremely well. One very strong move is e4, immediately kicking the knight and grabbing space. If white goes knight g1, or even tries queen e2 first, and then has to retreat anyway after queen e7, black is already getting the kind of position they want. And then I really like the move queen g5. Objectively, black does not have to play this way. A more standard move like d5 would already be more than enough, capturing the center and preparing to win back the f5 pawn. Black does not need to fear queen h5 check because g6 exists, but queen g5 is just fun. It attacks both g2 and f5, and in practice it more or less forces white to play g4, which is a massive concession. Those light squares become horribly weak. White's pieces are still mostly asleep on the back rank, and after queen e7, black can just calmly return the queen and continue with ideas like d5 or b6 and bishop b7 or bishop a6, all aimed at white's shattered light squares. White finds it very hard to develop here. The d-pawn is awkward, the g1 knight is awkward, and ideas like knight e5 f3 are constantly floating in the air. Black has a fantastic position. And so finally, let us jump to the most common response white plays on Lichess against the Rousseau Gambit. Accepting the pawn on move 4, which of course was not really a sacrifice in the first place. After takes f5, e4, white can try the more resilient knight d4, which is actually a better retreat, though not nearly as popular as just undeveloping the knight to g1. It looks like black could just take the knight, but then queen h5 check will become annoying, so there is no need to be greedy. Black should simply play knight f6, cover h5, finish development, and keep control. If white then goes knight takes c6, b takes c6, d3, d5, bishop b3, bishop takes f5, black gets a very comfortable game. The bishop can come bishop c5, black can castle, and if white ever takes on e4, black will most likely recapture with a knight and keep pressing along the f-file and toward f2. Again, white is the one who has to prove something. There is also the attempt queen e2, trying to pin the e-pawn and make life awkward for black. But just like in the Vienna, this does not really amount to much. Black calmly replies queen e7, and the knight still has to retreat. Then black comes in with ideas like knight d4, and white has simply lost too many tempi, while their pieces are standing around awkwardly. So let us continue from the main structure after takes f5, e4, knight g1, knight f6, d3. White is trying to remove the thorn on e4 so that the knight can breathe and maybe come back knight f3. There is also the more tactical try knight c3, where white basically says, all right, let us have a mess, but black should not be afraid of this. After d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen h5 check, king e7, d3, knight e5, bishop g5, knight f6, bishop takes f6, g takes f6. White has some activity, yes, but it is white who now has to prove compensation for the piece. Black can go queen e8, maybe take on c4 later, and it is not black who is in trouble here. Back to d3. Black continues very naturally with d5, once again hitting the bishop and preparing to win back the f5 pawn. After bishop b5, bishop takes f5, takes e4, white finally gets rid of the e4 pawn and frees the f3 square for the knight. White could also try something slower like knight e2, but that just leaves the knight more passive and does nothing to stop black's activity. After bishop takes e4, knight f3, bishop c5, castling. Just look at black's position. All the pieces are out, the king is safe, and black has two very unpleasant threats. One is knight g4, putting tremendous pressure on the f-file and especially the weak f2 square. The other is bishop takes f3, because if white recaptures with the pawn, the kingside structure gets wrecked, and if white recaptures with the queen, then knight e4 comes in and that same f2 square starts to scream again. The logical move for white would be knight c3, but it already leaves white in a critical condition if black simply continues knight g4 and already the position is bordering on winning. And the really nice part is that even if queens come off after knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, or even taking on d8 with a knight, which might be a bit more accurate, black's attack and activity continue in this endgame. This is one of those beautiful practical points. Sometimes people think that if they exchange queens, all danger disappears. But not when dealing with the mighty Rousseau Gambit. Black's rooks are active, the bishops are active, white's kingside is loose, and the position still plays itself very nicely. So what's the overall verdict on the Rousseau Gambit? I think it's a really good practical weapon, not because it's objectively perfect, it isn't, and not because white has no good moves, white absolutely does, but because in real games, especially blitz and rapid, white has so many opportunities to go wrong. They can grab the pawn and get hit by d5. They can play passively and let you build exactly the kingside attack you wanted. They can go for clever tactical ideas and find out that black's compensation is more than enough. They can even walk into a sound queen sacrifice and not realize until it's too late that they are the one being hunted.
And perhaps my favorite thing about this opening is that its ideas are actually quite coherent. This is not chaos for chaos's sake. You strike with f5, you hit back in the center with d5, you often challenge white's bishop on c4, you try to keep the game active, and if white mishandles the position, black's kingside initiative can become very serious very quickly. So if you enjoy that style of chess, and you don't mind playing something a little bit risky in return for a lot of practical chances, then yes, the Rousseau Gambit is definitely worth trying from time to time. And in future videos, I'll definitely cover more ways to meet the Italian, including more solid ones, because not every day has to begin with a pawn sacrifice and a vague promise of kingside violence. I'll also be looking at weapons against the Ruy Lopez and plenty of other openings. And as for the next video, that one will most likely be a more solid option for white players against 1e5, for those of you who are not quite willing to step into the muddy waters of the Vienna every single game.